So we're continuing in a series. We're going through a book by Dr. Ben Witherington. And really it's just about remembering some of the core values that we're attached to, but he puts them together in a way that maybe gets you to think a little bit more than what you typically would. And as I said earlier, we expect to have some of those copies here available for you. That will be next Sunday. So come on back. You're happy to buy one. We're happy to give you one. And if we run out, we'll get some more. So we encourage you, I'd encourage you to get it and read through it. And it's a small book. It's less than 100 pages, but if you actually include the scripture references, you're going to spend a little time in it. If you actually go and you look each one of them up, which I would encourage you to do, you'll be there for a little while. So today we're going to talk about God is life. That's really kind of the topic today. Not necessarily an easy one to really comprehend from the perspective of an ancient author. They really saw things very differently than we did when it comes into how they read or understand how things are alive. For us today, in 2021 as moderns, if I were to ask you, what does it mean to be alive? You would probably give me a series of different answers. Because for you, living is attached to oftentimes what you're doing, what kind of things are happening in your life. And so living in our modern world is hard to define. Now here's something I learned recently that surprised me. When it comes to defining what is life or what is alive, I learned something I didn't know. Biologists are not in agreement. There is no consensus on what defines something as being alive. That floored me. That just shocked me when I learned that. Now, we're not necessarily talking about that, although we are. For an ancient person, for someone who would have been in and around the times of these texts coming together, they would have seen something as alive if it has maybe some independent motion, if it breathes. They would have defined it very much as, a rock, not alive. A caterpillar on the rock, alive. An animal, alive. A fish, alive. In some cultures. Because fish didn't breathe air, some cultures didn't see fish as alive. They saw it as a creature, but they wouldn't define it as living. And so don't feel bad that you live in a time where people have a hard time defining life. They had a hard time agreeing to that too, thousands and thousands of years ago. But in our modern view, if I were to say to you, are you alive, and how do you define that? For some, it would be, well, I'm breathing, I'm going, I'm living, I'm going about my business. For some of you, you might say, I'm not living until I'm doing something I love, or doing something I like, or doing something that I feel like I'm supposed to do. Some of us will define it by what we do. Some of us might define it by what we have. I'm not living until I have X, Y, and Z. Maybe the car, the money, the house, whatever it may be. Some of you might say, I'm not really living until I'm in a relationship with someone else. That I haven't found my life until that happens. Do you understand how this can get complicated? Life can get complicated in its definition. And so when we talk about living in God's love and light, we need to take into account what the authors are trying to convey to us, what they mean by this. Otherwise, and we'll see this as we get into some of the other text, we can get caught defining living as something that we should never define it as. And then we can find ourselves in a spot where we say, well, I don't really think I'm living unless I'm doing this thing. And I think we're going to see that the authors are going to shred that as we go through. Now, fair warning, this series has been really difficult because it's about getting a kind of a grand perspective of the story as we go through. I usually try to narrow and focus in on a text. But today, again, we're going to be moving quickly from beginning towards the end. And so try to keep up. If you've got a Bible turned on or you've got one opened up, you best have the table of contents ready because you're going to be doing some referencing to some of these things. But when we talk about life, as you can imagine, we're going to just jump right back to the beginning and let it maybe set a little bit of a stage for us, okay? Here we go. Then God said, "Let the waters swarm with fish and other life. Let the skies be filled with birds of every kind." So God created great sea creatures, it's great sea monsters actually, and every living thing that scurries and swarms in the water, and every sort of bird, each producing offspring of the same kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the earth produce every sort of animal, each producing offspring of the same kind, livestock, small animals that scurry along the ground, and wild animals." And we see this and we think, we get images that come into our mind of these creatures, and you can, if you've ever had a little creature, you can see them taking quick breaths, right? And if you might even be able to feel their fast little heartbeats, and you think, this is alive. This is what he meant by alive. They're animated. They have independent motion. There's something in them that gives them some sort of a will, whether that be instinct, whatever it may be. But for an ancient author, it was fairly simple. If I have an object near me that seems to move and go on its own, then it is being empowered by life. There is a life that is within it, that is taking it somewhere. Okay? We catch that? It's fairly straightforward for them. Their cultures are built on what they can observe and what they can understand. And so for them, it's fairly simple. But one thing I want to point out really quick, this is the little slight nerd moment, okay? Bear with me. There's a term that's repeated all through this section, and the English doesn't really do it justice. But those things that I have highlighted, they are the exact same phrase each time in Hebrew, in the original language. But because we're English readers and it's in English translation, we try to help us read it so we don't have the same things repeating. But it's the same phrase in each case, and it's nefesh haya. You can repeat it if you want. Nefesh haya. Try it. Nefesh haya. Nefesh is the word that's often translated soul, but I think it's a bad translation. It actually means throat. And haya is the word translated as life, living, existing. And so the reason those two things are connected is this air that we breathe in and out, where does it go through? The throat. So they connect it together. So these highlighted words that are here, fish and other life, that's nefesh haya. Let the water swarm with nefesh haya. God created great sea creatures and nefesh haya. God said, let the earth produce. Isn't that an interesting term? The earth produce nefesh haya. And that's important because of the next verse. Then the Lord God formed the man from the dust of the ground. He breathed the breath of life into the man's nostrils, and the man became a nefesh haya. The authors in the text, right off of the bat, are wanting to convey to us that we are in a category of creation that shares some traits. We share some things. Once God breathes in, and He doesn't breathe into the other animals, but other verses indicate the other animals have the breath of God, that they breathe with the same thing that we do. But in this case, this one's a little bit unique. Notice it's not the earth that brought forth the nefesh haya. It was God that used the earth to bring forth this particular human nefesh haya. And by the way, that word man is ha-adam. It's the humans. It's humankind. It's not gender specific. It's humankind. He brought the humans about. Okay? So, make sense? This is a foundational concept. If I were to ask you the question, for an ancient reader, where does life come from? What do they understand? It comes from this Creator God. This is where it all originates for especially someone who had been ancient Jewish believer. But almost all cultures assign God some aspect of being responsible for us being alive, existing, essentially. And so it kind of begs the question, now that they're here, what are they going to do? What's their point and purpose? Now, God goes on to expand that later, and we won't go through that in great detail. He makes a special place for the humans to be, called Eden. And then he makes an even more special place called the garden, which is attached to the side of Eden, it sounds like. And he places humans into this spot, and he gives them some things to do. They're to work the ground, they're to protect it. Work it and protect it. We don't get an indication of them doing either, especially the guarding part, because they keep letting snakes in. Okay? They keep letting things in that maybe shouldn't be there. And so for them and for us, this really begs the question, how do you know when you're living? How do you know when you're doing what you're supposed to be doing? And for that, we consult a lot of different sources, right? We try to determine what it is we should be doing and whether we're on the path, whether we're living the way we're supposed to be living. And this is not a common or unique to us. It's very common, even in this culture. People will turn to all kinds of things to try to figure out what to do. In fact, another author would later come along, a prophet would come along a little bit later and give some warnings about this, because as the story unfolds, these humans seem to turn to just about anything other than their Creator to figure out how to live their life. And the prophet catches this pretty well. This is Isaiah. Someone may say to you, let's ask the mediums and those who consult the spirits of the dead. With their whisperings and mutterings, they'll tell us what to do. And I think this is a great summary. This is a great summary. Someday my children will probably have ai.google.com, and they can go in and say, what should I do today? And the artificial intelligence will whisper and murmur to them, well, here's what you should do. Based upon your calendar and all of your emails and your Facebook friends and your YouTube videos, here's what we think your next step should be today. Humans, we constantly are looking for direction on what to do, aren't we? And here the prophet is being really genius about what he's about to do. Some will say to you, let's go ask the spirits of the, did you catch that? Dead. But what are you? Are you a dead creature or are you a living creature? You're a living creature, which is why the prophet would go on to say this. But shouldn't people ask God for guidance? Should the living seek guidance from the dead? What's the implication? God is alive. Why wouldn't you make your source of what to do and how to live the living God? He's kind of genius in the way that he's worded this. But you see, you and I, we don't want to do that. We'd rather learn what to do and know what to do from so many different sources. And what happens when we seek things from the wrong source, when we go to the source that isn't alive, when we avoid the living God for our source, what happens? Well, God says this is Jeremiah, aside from James, the second best named prophet in all of Scripture. I say that so that he won't cut off my screen up there. For my people have done two evil things. They have abandoned me, the fountain of what kind of water? Living water. And they have dug for themselves cracked cisterns that can hold no water at all. It's interesting, when we had a chance to be in Israel, we would be in spots where you could see these massively deep, carved out wells, basically containers that would hold water. And you could go down into them and you would see that some of them are still intact. They would hold water no problem, but some have actually been cracked because of earthquakes and other things in the area, and the water would just seep through. It's fascinating. These images that they use. They've done two evil things. They've abandoned me, and they're trying to fill their own wells their own way. They've left what's living, and they're going to something that's not living. And an interesting little factoid, oftentimes whenever you see water, when anyone digs a well, and most of the time when you see the word for water in the Hebrew Bible in the Old Testament, it actually is Hayah Mayim, living, Hayah, living Mayim, water. But our scriptures don't translate that out. Jesus would go on to expand this a little bit more. Then Jesus said, beware, guard against every kind of greed. Read this slowly. Life is not measured by how much you own. Life is not measured by what you have done. Life is not measured by the things you can hold and carry, or even the things that you can put your name against. And this is one, if you were to take a note and you wanted to meditate on this and maybe work with some warm beverages for a little while and just really kind of contemplate this, it's quite a statement. Because what he's indicating here, what he's touching on, he's looking at the people around him and his knowledge of folks in the past, and what he's saying is, you and I have this tendency to create a baseline of what our life should be, and then we begin to measure ourselves against that all the time. And if we don't have a baseline, we go to the second best thing, which is someone else. We look at someone else's life and we begin to measure and compare. If you don't believe me, then the next time you're surfing some social site, check how you feel. Because if you see something and you think, man, those people have it together, they're really living, that's a happy family. My little girl's, my youngest, she's got this family. What's the name of that family she likes to watch on YouTube? Do you remember their name? I don't remember their name right off the bat. Their family that has a bunch of kids, and they do all these YouTube videos. And it is, I'm telling you, it is the happiest family I have ever seen in my lifetime. These people have no problems at all. And for a while, my youngest would be like, you could just tell, I wish that was my family. Because they never show dad going to work. They never show mom having a bad day. They never show, mom and dad coming home after a really rough day. They never show that. And if you measure your life against that picture, you're going to come up short. And the reason why is you and I don't really know what's going on in the life of those folks, do we? We really don't know. How many times have you been caught by surprise of someone who falls from grace, falls from a high point, and you're like, oh my goodness, I had no idea. Of course you didn't. You don't know them. You don't know what's really going on. It's foolish to build your life baseline against what somebody else is doing. And Jesus very quickly just comes in and says, look, don't measure your life. Don't measure living by that. It's dangerous. It will put you into a place that you think you're never going to measure up. And nothing will ever turn that measuring stick off in your mind. As hard as you and I try, almost all of our lives, we will look back and think maybe we didn't do it. You know this instinctively. If you're young, I had the conversation with my girls this morning over breakfast. My littlest wants to be like the middle, because the middle is 10, and the middle gets to do things that the 5-year-old doesn't get to do. So she's measuring her life at 5. No one taught her how to do this. She wants to be like her big sister. And the middle one, who's 10, looks at the 18-year-old, and guess what she does? She wants to be 18. She's measuring her life against that. This is what she wants. I didn't teach her how to do that. I didn't do that. My 18-year-old looks at her parents and says, I know what I don't want to be. And so she's already setting a different kind of measuring stick for her life. And I know that for folks who are in their 30s and 40s, you're kind of in this mix where you're thinking, well, am I where I need to be in order to enjoy being older? But I still feel young and I'm not sure. And so you're constantly measuring. And for those of you who are a little older, you might be looking back in your life going, man, there's so much more. If I just hadn't had a cup of coffee at McDonald's 5 times a week, I would have had so much more time. You're constantly looking back and measuring. Does any of this make sense? You hear what I'm saying? The wisdom of Jesus is pretty in-depth. Don't measure your life by what you've acquired, by what you've done. Rather, Jesus would be described as this. Jesus gave life to everything that was created, and his life brought light to everyone. It's more of an action statement. It's more of a, as you go through, stay in this life. And there's that reference to light. That was last week's topic. These things all kind of merge up together. Love and light and life, these all sort of join up together. And Jesus is sitting there saying, you can attempt to measure your life and fill your cracked cistern as much as you want to, but it will never be full. Rather, I am the author of life, and I want you to stay in that life with me as you go forward. Because apart from the author of life, you're not really living. You may be breathing. You may be a creature that has an autonomous mind that can do what you want to do. But you're not connected to the one who breathed the life into you, which is the whole point. That is actually the entire storyline of Scripture, is trying to reconnect us with the one who breathed life into us. That's why we can safely say that God is life. New Testament authors connected some of this for us as well, and the last part we'll look at. The Scriptures tell us, Paul would say, the first man, Adam, became a living person. We saw that, didn't we? We opened with that. This first human became a nefesh hayah. And if you notice that, he's become a living person. What was the one thing? They had one job. They were to take this blessing that they had been given into the world and begin to expand it. Essentially, take Eden and begin to expand it in and around their space that they're in. To take this thing that God has started and move it somewhere, to grow it. To take this kingdom that God has established, and He set humans, man and woman, as co-rulers over that, and take this thing somewhere. And they failed to do that. And part of what they would be taking with them was this life, this connection that they've had. They'd be taking that everywhere that they go, and they're replicating it. Now, we have all kinds of images that come to our mind, and that might be right or wrong, that's okay. It's still the mission. In this case, Adam, the first man, became that, but they failed at it. What ends up happening? They end up getting exiled from it. You with me? But this Jesus who came along, who Paul refers to as the last human, that is Christ, is a life-giving spirit. Where the first human, Adam, what reigns through people at that point is what they'll call death, this separation from the source of life. But when Jesus shows up on the scene, He becomes life itself, and in that, a source of giving it. He would use things like this: I'm a fountain of living water. Come and take a drink. And when you drink, you're not going to be thirsty ever again. He would say things like, I am the resurrection and I am the life. He would make these statements. I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life. He is, and this connection Paul makes is fascinating, because Jesus doesn't show up in Genesis 2. It's God who breathes life into them, and they become a nefesh hayah. But as it turns out, it's Jesus who is actually the source of this life. And what's He doing? He's going all around creation, giving it freely and saying, take this with you where you go and make sure people know about it. Try to bring them into this new family of God that's being established. Christ is the life-giving Spirit here. And so here's what happens when it comes to this definition of God as life, Jesus is the life giver. As you look through the story of Scripture, it turns out that it's the Creator, through Jesus, that's the only one. He's the only one who can really satisfy. Satisfy is the term to say to put you at peace with yourself and with the world around you. Some of you have tried to be satisfied through other things, and it doesn't work. It may work for a time. It would turn out that this life giver, through Jesus, the one who gives life, is the only one who can make us whole or complete, that makes us understand that now I'm existing exactly the way I was intended to exist to begin with. It's this life giver, this life that comes from God, that is what heals us. Not only from occasionally physical infirmary, but heals us from a perspective of where we've been wounded. Our spirit, our heart, our head has been wounded. It takes real life to repair that. And that life comes in the form of one of the first things we looked at, which is love. We see that on a regular basis in the ministry that we're involved with. The first connecting point for people who have been severely wounded, traumatized, is just sitting with them and loving them. And that seems to kick on a little bit of a light, and for the first time they might begin to feel alive. It's this life. I guess I could have just said this and saved you 90 seconds. It's this life that tells you you're human. It's this life that's connected to Jesus that tells you you're more than just a nefesh hayah that wanders the earth or swims in the sea. It's being connected to God and His life, the living God, that really sets us up for walking in the earth as we were meant to. It's really important, and it's really hard to define. It's really hard to define. I think Jesus left us a few things that we need to pay attention to. He is the source, and we shouldn't try to measure it. We'll just get into trouble that way. So we can sum this up quickly. God is both the living God and God of the living. I think the only thing I want to go back on and look, to say, what does that mean for us today? Well, that makes it really hard because it's really stage of life dependent. Not everybody is in the same stage of life in this room. Some have come in with different challenges and different pain points today than you had even last week. Some have different joys. Some may have different losses. And the whole point, the crux of this is to simply say that when it comes to trying to live, when it comes to trying to understand how to live an effective whole life, we would be wise to turn to the living God and to nothing else for that. Make sense? Because God is life. And apart from God, when you look through the text, you're separated from life. It's what really allows you and I to see where we are in this world. It also allows us to see where others are. And to have the kind of humility and patience and compassion and mercy for them that we should have. Because imagine for just a moment, I know none of you would have this problem. You're way too smart. But imagine for just a moment that you didn't ever measure your life against another or measure your life against what you thought your life should be, something that you've crafted yourself. Imagine you've never done that, but others have, and how hard it would be to live your life if you're trying to measure yourself against someone else. And that's what most of us will do. Otherwise, Jesus would not have had to say what he said. So we can look out into the world with compassion and mercy and patience, through love, knowing that we can be a source of God's light and God's life to them, to say, you can be set free from this measuring stick that you apply against yourself. And that kind of message, I believe, will resonate with people. It will resonate with people who feel like they've had the measuring stick held up against them their whole life. Like I said, my 5-year-old, I have never told her to be like her older sisters. She has come up with that on her own. And as a father, just from a personal perspective, all I've ever done with my kids is say, do your best. Just do your best. Not my best, not the best that's the best for me, or what I think the best is for you. Don't get me wrong, if they ask for that, I'll tell them. If they ask, what do you think's best? Sit down, we're in for it. But if they don't do it, there's no measuring stick applied. Because they will become experts at creating their own baseline for themselves by which they will constantly fail. And what I want to be at the end of the day, as a parent, is someone who can be there at the end of that to capture them, to catch them when they fall. And then ask them some straightforward questions. What were you doing? Why were you holding yourself to that standard? It didn't matter to me. I'm going to love you anyway. I'm going to rescue you anyway. Doesn't that sound good? And in that, they can rest and begin to find that life again. To say, maybe I don't need to live up to a standard that I've created. Guys, this is a message that the world could really use. Because there's a lot of people who are looking at themselves and looking into the world, and they're putting a measuring stick against it, and they're saying society, the world, all the things around me seem to be coming up short of what I think it should be. And we need to pause and take a step back and ask ourselves this question. Where, as a living being, as a nefesh hayah, connected to Jesus, living, where does he want me to be in this? Am I playing the role he's asked me to play in spreading the love and the grace and the peace and the good news and the gospel of Jesus into my world?